TSR had the game that had been propelled to national recognition, thanks to misguided attempts to ban it, sad controversies, and a passing appearance in E.T. While the money rolled in, bad decisions were made. When the money stopped rolling in, worse decisions were made. One can dress it up however one likes, but even putting a bow tie on it cannot change the despicable efforts to deny people what was rightfully theirs. This should have been their finest hour, but instead, it was the age of thieves. TSR had been flying high thanks to a popular product and sudden nationwide attention. And while the game was the subject of much discussion, to a small extent so was TSR itself. Gygax, Brian, and Kevin Bloom had no background in running a company, but in the interviews for the article, they talked like that was the secret of their success. It was in fact the opposite. TSR succeeded in spite of their bumbling mismanagement, not because of it. One thing that helped TSR start out and expand was a combination of its location and the willingness of employees to move to that location. I can tell you from personal experience that small-town Wisconsin has a low cost of living, so you can get by on what in a large urban area would be unthinkable. Employees could struggle by on 10% above federal minimum wage if things are 25% less than the national average. And for business, there are plenty of reasons that expenses are going to be so much less. Real estate, for instance. It wasn't actually bought by TSR, but by a separate partnership between Gygax and Brian Bloom, and then rented to the company. The price was low enough that they could afford to do that. The company made it to that flashpoint because the low pay was sufficient for the time being, and once it got national exposure, it was making so much money that their screw-ups were covered. But no, they claimed, gamers are better equipped to manage resources than those with business degrees. And they also spoke of adherence to aspects of Japanese businesses in a way that was frankly cliché. Gygax became more distant from day-to-day operations, and the problems at home got worse. The details are unknown, but there was a lot of gossip. The most common conclusion was that Gary Gygax began sleeping around. Some say that Mary Jo began drinking heavily, possibly from the estrangement from their religion, others because of Gygax's infidelity and cocaine use. Others say it was the reverse, that Gygax, along with everything else, began drinking heavily. If Gygax would have hoped to get sympathy from people, he had not done anything to cultivate it. During his public feud with Rick Loomis of Flying Buffalo, Loomis said that because of his insistence on quality products, he would never have the many riches that Gygax had. Upon reading the list of the many signs of his success that Loomis had written, Gygax sent back a correction to Loomis saying that he had 30 heads of horses, not 29. Oh, and his estate was much larger than the paltry 5 acres that Loomis had mentioned. With this pointless gloating and his public rants, Loomis could not resist mentioning that Mary Jo got Gygax's massive estate in the divorce. Gygax was interested in the Hollywood developments, among which was going to be a Saturday morning cartoon, telling of a group of kids pulled into the world of D&D, given magical items and working to find their way home. But CBS did not promote the show very well. In fact, the sole promo that I could find for it, which is now sadly gone, was combined with an ad for a brand new CBS animated series. It was Hulk Hogan announcing, "Hulkamania is bursting out on Saturdays," and then a voice adding as an afterthought, "along with Dungeons and Dragons." The animated series ran 3 seasons, but very short ones, totaling only 27 episodes. Because they were not aware that the show was going to be ending, the kids never do make it home. However, that was finally corrected in an officially approved live-action piece in 2019.
hora de voltar pra casa, crianças.
Tolos, nunca escaparão!
Faz alguma coisa!
Yes, the cliffhanger was resolved in a Brazilian car commercial, but it was officially licensed, so you can consider this the canonical ending to the show. That level of weirdness was in keeping with Gygax's life now that he'd gone Hollywood. To conduct business on TSR's behalf for these many planned projects, Gygax was given a $10,000 a month home called the King Vito Ranch, which emerged entirely from the mind of a 16-year-old boy. It was filled with tables for wargaming, gorgeous women who frequently had appeared in videos focused on being spanked, and the various members of Gygax's entourage. This frequently included Flint Dille, writer of numerous children's shows, including the Five Faces of Evil storyline for the Transformers that was considered for the movie. Dille would also frequently bring around Frank Miller, future writer of The Dark Knight Returns. I'll give you a moment to reflect on the mental image of a middle-aged man from Wisconsin in his Hollywood mansion, surrounded by cocaine, gaming tables, spank models, and being visited by the guy who writes G.I. Joe and the guy who originated the goddamn Batman meme. Suddenly, the Brazilian car commercial seems perfectly normal. Needless to say, Gygax was more hands-off now, leaving the Blooms free to run TSR. It would not be apt to add into the ground, but it would be somewhat leaning in the right direction, as their lack of business skills was compounded by fiscal irresponsibility. Picture for a moment the Great Gatsby with the demeanor of a Texas oil tycoon. The nouveau riche meets cartoonish spendthrift, and you get an idea of their management of TSR at this time. Money was thrown around with wild abandon. And as previously mentioned, TSR became little more than a means to employ or bail out their relatives, regardless of skills, education, or even a willingness to come to work. This compounded their problem, because by not filling key positions with those with training, you didn't have experts in place to guide or mitigate the damage. You could get by with a Peter Adkinson at the top so long as he has a Lisa Stevens behind him, reminding him to act like a grown-up. But TSR was filled with unqualified people in key positions. One area where the company was growing well was in fiction. Choose-your-own-adventure books were proving a big hit, books where the reader made decisions on what the protagonist does in the story, often leading to a bad end. Similar works to that were Games Workshop's Fighting Fantasy series, and Joe Deaver's Lone Wolf series, which will be familiar to my Patreon members given our weekly Let's Play delves into those books. TSR offered their own D&D version of Choose Your Own Adventure, written by Rose Estes, called Endless Quest. The books were a huge hit, and so in keeping with TSR history, when we have creative people making hit products for us, let's screw them over. Estes was supposed to have stock options, but when she attempted to act on those options, she was blocked, told that Brian Bloom had spoken out of turn. She wound up quitting when she wasn't given sufficient alternate compensation. This wasn't the first time, but it really made it obvious that this was a problem, and it got worse when Will Niebling, who had worked on the third AD&D book with Gygax and gone on to sales and marketing, was getting ready to exercise his stock options and was beaten to the punch by being fired. He had only that day to exercise his options, but, to the Bloom's amazement and horror, he was able to raise the funds from a metaphorical passing around the hat. So they were forced to then just say, no, you can't have them. He, naturally, sued them. When inquired about this and other instances, they finally admitted that it was down to Arneson and McGarry. They didn't want anyone else hostile to the company having shares of their stock. Of course, promising it and then not delivering tends to make people hostile too. and the case didn't go terribly well. At one point, TSR's lawyers pointed out that the contract to Niebling was signed on Brian Bloom's wedding day, so it should be considered null and void because he was probably drunk. Niebling's lawyers brought in others at TSR, though, who were similarly promised and then denied shares, to show this was a pattern of behavior. By which I mean the denying of shares, not signing contracts while drunk, although you wouldn't know that given some of the choices that TSR made at this time.
A team of divers raised a part of Wisconsin history known as the Lucius Newberry.
The Lucius Newberry, a side-wheel steamship which caught fire and was released to float out onto the lake and sink, rather than risk setting the town of Lake Geneva itself ablaze, was found by divers in 1981. After a highly illegal salvage operation, they ran out of money and begged the city to finance the rest, who, of course, refused. Who would be stupid enough to want to pay for this scorched wood and rusted junk?
Among the fascinated spectators was Brian Pitzer, a spokesman for TSR Hobbies Incorporated. TSR, which makes the popular game Dungeons & Dragons, is the financial backer of the salvage project.
Considering this effort some kind of bizarre community outreach, they financed this ill-advised venture and wound up with a whole lot of wrecked junk that they wound up having to ask the Smithsonian to take away. This wasn't the only sunken venture they were interested in. Gen Con East was in serious trouble and decided, against all advice, to bail it out and ensure it could go forward. It was believed that this effort was to spite Gamma, but it's uncertain if that was the case because of the serious lack of judgment. While nothing can top raising an old sunken steamship for no other reason than it's nearby, a close contender was the serious consideration given to buying a section of railroad. There was talk of holding D&D events on the trains. Fortunately for the company's finances, that idea never went forward. Another problem was that they seemed convinced that sales were going to grow exponentially for several years. Even without the arrival of Trivial Pursuit, this was unrealistic. But with that plan, they began adding staff by the dozens. The Hotel Claire was no longer enough, and they acquired a facility called the Torrent Building. But even that wasn't enough for the rapidly growing company, so a new headquarters was set up on Sheridan Springs Road. With their expansion, they went into other markets like education, which had potential, and what was a gift-wrapped opportunity for them, SPI, one of the two giants of the market, was in serious financial trouble, thanks to ill-advised efforts to branch outside of their traditional historical miniatures area. TSR moved to take advantage of this. They had been wanting the company to branch out into miniatures, with the goal of marrying their existing strengths and their D&D IP with the figures market. And it would have worked, had they not executed it with all the skill of a drunken virgin trying to unhook his first bra. Rather than performing due diligence, TSR loaned SPI over $400,000 with the assets of the company put up as collateral. With TSR having control, they made Kevin Bloom president of SPI, meaning he was now in control of the company. Then, going into the books more thoroughly, they found out that SPI was in greater debt than they thought, and its assets weren't as valuable. So rather than pumping more cash into SPI to save it, SPI, controlled by TSR, defaulted on its loan to TSR, ensuring that SPI, controlled by TSR, would now be absorbed entirely by that of its creditor, TSR. The industry was horrified that a staple of that industry had now been gutted in that way, and Avalon Hill seized the opportunity this presented. They made an offer to the design staff of SPI, who all immediately tendered their resignations and began working at Avalon Hill, depriving TSR of the talent that would have been the true value of the company, and left them with the hollowed-out remnants of SPI. Combined with Gygax's editorials, you can understand why some thought that this omni-shambles on display was part of an intentional effort to dismantle Gamma. Someone would indeed succeed at what they were trying to do, their old partners at Games Workshop. It was called Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and 4 years later would see the launch of a related product, Warhammer 40,000, aka Warhammer 40K. With all the mess taking place, Kevin Bloom tried again to salvage things with Gamma, rightly noting that when the leader of an industry and the organization representing that industry are at war, it robs legitimacy from both of them. It was easier to pull off because Gygax was far too busy focusing on his Hollywood ambitions to care about the industry that much. He was tired of waiting on the D&D movie, so he began working with Flint Dille on making a string of low-budget pictures set in Greyhawk. I should note that Gygax's personal erotic tastes are his own business, but I cannot help but note the absurdity of the quasi-fiddling while Rome is burning as TSR starts running into financial trouble to find out that Gygax is handwriting into his film script notes about ideal places to add spanking scenes in his movies. His son, Ernie, was also trying to get projects off the ground like Smallest Samurai, but that didn't seem to go anywhere. The greatest success they had was one they stumbled into by accident. For some reason, they decided to buy the old-time SF publication Amazing Stories. And it turned out that Steven Spielberg was interested in using the pulp magazine's name and reputation for his television anthology show. But as with the D&D success, it was more proof that dumb luck was just there to protect them rather than a sign of skillful management on TSR's part. With all these mistakes piling up, layoffs had to begin, starting with layabout members of the Bloom extended family. Mike Carr, one of only 2 members of the Twin City Gamers left at the company, was one of the people laid off, though he did land on his feet. In yet another bizarre twist in this story, Carr answered an ad for a job that would make him a turtle investor, that is, part of a mad experiment by Richard Dennis to take people with no trading experience and turn them into traders. Because Mike Carr had helped with the creation of D&D, there was sympathy for him in the job interview, as 2 of the interviewers had children who played the game. His comment that the figure he admired from history was Rommel raised a few eyebrows, so he explained that despite being a German general, he was not a Nazi and was respected by both Allied and Axis leaders. They must have been satisfied with that answer because he got the job, and now had a man teaching him how to trade stocks better than a Harvard MBA, which was an improvement over his previous supervisor, who couldn't fit a game board into its own box. But back at TSR, things were not getting any better, and in another round of layoffs, the head of HR that had the ugly business of chopping off heads had his own head chopped off. The plan to solve this was to turn TSR into 3 companies, each run by one of the 3, so that they could get a handle on things. Gygax naturally wound up with everything related to those West Coast operations. But this solution was no solution at all. There was conflict over the use of IP as one example. Another was that Frank Menzer, who was supposed to be editing AD&D products, was so drowning in paperwork for all 3 companies plus the parent company, he didn't have time to do his actual job. Plus, we should mention the basic illogic of presuming that the trio, which were having trouble running the company as 3 presidents, could somehow solve all of their problems by being the sole 3 members of their board. It was finally accepted that 3 more seats needed to be added to the board, so that they could get more seasoned management to provide input in order to help end this clumsy mess and get TSR through this financial crisis. The 3 new board members were Wesley Summer, president of a medical equipment firm, James Huber, a partner at the law firm that represented Gygax during his divorce, and Robert Kind, HR head at a manufacturing firm. They all had sound financial management experience and thus would not only provide valuable guidance, but would calm the fears of the bank and creditors. With the need to tighten belts, someone had the idea to not pay Arneson his royalties for Monster Manual 2. Arneson, to no one's surprise, sued them. This time, however, rather than settling with him, they fought it all the way into the courts, and the judge made a ruling. Arneson gets his share of the royalties. It's got so much in common that it's not unreasonable to say that Monster Manual 2 is an update of the original Monster Manual. There were even links to previous monsters in the original monster manual, which made it especially damning. But with things as bad as they were, there was a pay cut across the board at TSR, accompanied with a notice explaining that this was a short-term solution and the plan was that things would be restored in a year and the difference made up. Well, that was when Kevin Bloom was hit by a 1-2 punch that spelled the end for him. First, the deal made with his sister-in-law, where she would be given a stipend and TSR would pay for everything she needed to go to school, set off alarms once it was discovered. That called into question his judgment, but then the Niebling lawsuit over shares brought something new to their attention. Richard Canings recently hired his corporate secretary, asked James Huber, who was a lawyer, remember, about the legal issues around Kevin Bloom's shares in TSR. Seems that while on paper Melvin Bloom sold his shares back to TSR and Kevin Bloom bought them, no money actually changed hands. In effect, the shares were simply given to Kevin and the paperwork claiming it was all happening properly wasn't true. It may seem like a small thing, but given the degree to which the TSR employees were being screwed over on shares that they were entitled to, finding out that Kevin got his shares illegitimately provoked outrage, with an insistence that the shares go to the company but then be put up for sale to shareholders, and what's more, that Gygax and Bryan be prohibited from buying them because their refusal to intervene was a tacit indication that they had passed on purchasing them. Canings immediately sent out a memo to the whole company indicating that he was taking control of day-to-day operations away from Kevin Bloom, and soon the biggest head to roll came. Kevin Bloom himself was fired from the company. With Kevin Bloom out, the hope had been that this would signal the end of the perpetual crises that threatened TSR. But the looming crisis overall was debt. The company couldn't hope to earn enough cash in the short term to resolve the problem, prompting interest in bringing in outside investors. But caution in handling the Blooms was called for because the family controlled close enough to 50% that they could possibly form a coalition and replace the board to one that would rubber stamp their decisions that would likely wind up bringing an end to TSR. Gygax was still spending most of his time in Southern California, so a Beverly Hills investment group of 3 people, referred to only as the Foreman Group, and whose identities were kept a secret, looked to make a major investment in TSR. A severance package for the Bloom brothers was discussed, but they insisted that any such departure had to include the purchase of their shares. If they no longer had control over the company, they could no longer protect their investment. Obviously, they had done a poor job protecting that investment so far, but nevertheless, that was their view, which the Foreman Group was willing to consider. But there was a problem. The original shareholder agreement. To keep outsiders from taking control of TSR, they were forbidden from buying them out, unless that was to be excised from the shareholder agreement. On March 1st, the changes were made, and TSR was now able to have its shares purchased by outsiders, something that Gygax had wanted to avoid at all costs. It also lowered the value of the stock from $2,400 per share to just $300 a share. Assuming that Niebling didn't win his lawsuit, if that were to happen, it would be further devalued to $240. After that, more layoffs, including the last few members of the Bloom family. Gygax realized that the situation was too dire to pretend that he was the emperor of the gaming hobby anymore, so he decided to make some changes. A lot of gaming businesses were reeling. Even the giant Milton Bradley was hurting between failure in the video game market and the impact of Trivial Pursuit. Flying Buffalo, who had naturally gravitated towards Dave Arneson given their mutual animosity with Gygax, was forced to cancel plans to release his Blackmore modules. But Gygax believed that while D&D sales were stagnant, that was only for the core sets. The modules were doing just fine. They needed to have more modules out there if they wanted to bring in some money. A massive hit that they'd had was the creation of a husband and wife team, Tracy and Laura Hickman, who wanted to make a truly scary and gothic vampire adventure. After 5 years of playtesting it on Halloween's, Ravenloft was published by TSR and was a huge win for the company. Tracy Hickman was brought on board as a full-time employee and put with the other writers, still stuck over in the Hotel Claire. The building had such structural issues that Hickman developed a habit of his that he couldn't shake, where he would brace his foot behind his chair, because the tilt of the building would cause his chair to roll. But the work of Tracy and Laura would help revolutionize modules away from straightforward dungeon crawls to real storytelling adventures. On the trip from Utah to Wisconsin, Tracy and Laura fleshed out an idea for a major undertaking that they referred to as Project Overlord, which would become Dragonlance, a multimedia project for them. It was going to be a series of D&D modules, a trilogy of books, plus there were going to be miniatures and other products. The first book was going to be Dragons of Autumn Twilight, which incidentally is a book that I've looked at in more detail if you would like to learn more about it. So with the demand for more modules, Gygax was interested in getting more of them onto shelves, and he was prepared to swallow his pride if he had to. That's why, after everything that had happened, after repeatedly casting Arneson as a fat, untrustworthy thief in his campaigns, Gygax went to Dave Arneson and offered to publish Blackmore through TSR. Arneson was willing. The 1981 agreement had just ended, so he was no longer receiving royalties on the AD&D products. Just the original D&D, which, of course, was no longer being sold. So selling his Blackmore modules was an opportunity for him. Having buried the hatchet with one enemy, Gygax then went on to the next, and wrote a piece withdrawing his previous call for a boycott of Origins, encouraging players to attend all good conventions related to the hobby, and even authorizing a D&D event there, even if they wouldn't organize it themselves. Gygax had apparently realized how precarious his position was, and how he would need to have as few enemies as possible, considering the number that he was likely about to create. Barely 2 weeks after the stockholder agreement was amended to pave the way for the Foreman Group, a new meeting was held, where Gygax announced he had played his trump card. He had exercised his right to purchase 700 shares of TSR stock at the originally valued price of $100 each. And the cherry on top was that Gygax didn't have to pay a dime out of pocket for them. TSR was so behind on their royalties to him, they simply forgave $70,000 in back royalties in order to cover the price of the shares. This brought Gygax personally to 49.6% of the total shares of TSR, and with the 40 shares that his son Ernie Gygax had, allowed him 51% of the total. Having explained that to them, the board declared Gygax, already chairman, to now also be president and CEO of TSR 11 days later. And the public announcement was that TSR was going to be handling its financial problems itself. Gygax had stayed in control, but this hadn't solved the problem yet. It does little good to ensure that you are the recognized captain if you still have no idea how to stop the ship from sinking. Keenings was removed, and Gygax revealed what he'd been doing since that March 1st meeting, courting Lorraine Williams, Flint Dilley's sister who lived in Chicago and had come to Gen Con with Gygax and Flint. Dilley directed Gygax to her when he decided not to personally invest in TSR after he'd been approached by Gygax. Now, the reason that Gygax had gone in that direction was that Flint and Lorraine's grandfather had published Buck Rogers back in the day, and so they had ownership of that IP. With the success of Star Wars, Buck Rogers in the 25th Century had been picked up for 2 seasons on primetime television, and of course all the merchandise that came with it. So the family had money, but Flint and Lorraine were not the Blooms, ready to simply throw it around as if there was an endless supply. Hence his desire not to get involved, and her insistence on going over TSR carefully before considering. While her degree was in medieval history, not business, she had an overall eye for it. After her examination of the books at the Sheridan Springs building, Gygax said to her, "You're good." Gygax offered her a chance to be VP of Administration, but he'd need her to invest in the company to keep it afloat. A third of her salary the first year would be used to purchase TSR stock. She also would need to purchase $50,000 worth of stock upon acceptance, and a further $100,000 the following calendar year. This kind of investment ensured that she'd be committed to TSR, but not so large that she could pose a threat to his control, which is exactly what he wanted. Recent events hadn't changed him so much as made him realize caution was in order, but Gygax still wanted to be at the top, dictating things to those who will obey. But unlike the early days, he wanted someone else to handle things directly so he wouldn't have to. He didn't want to run TSR, he just wanted to be in control of it. Like King Robert of Game of Thrones, I'll fight the battles, but leave it to the king's hand to take care of all the day-to-day stuff. So with Lorraine Williams as his weapon to placate the board, Gygax was able to convince them that he had a plan to move forward, and that the Blooms would be able to exit with a purchase of their stock at the price of $340.87 per share, which was to include the 700 shares that Brian had an option from his days at the company. Gygax had thought he'd played the game masterfully, but there was one factor that he hadn't considered. The day-to-day operations of the company depended upon the good graces of outsiders who were not convinced that him being in charge was a good thing. He had not only been in charge of TSR on paper during the time when it made one financially dubious decision after the next, but when Kevin spoke in public to the fact all three of them had equal power in the boardroom, Gygax felt the need to get on the record that he was the one at the top when it came to decisions on day-to-day operations. His need to not just be in control, but make sure that everybody knew he was in control, had just bitten him in the ass. When the banks got wind of what had happened, that instead of a coalition of investors bringing in new capital, that instead Gygax had started a small revolution and put himself at the top, they cut TSR's credit by more than half. A desperate Gygax went to them to convince them that they needed at least another $500,000. But the bank said that Gygax was clearly not aware of just how deeply in debt TSR was, and that the stock buyback was ill-advised. They would not support it. And as far as the board's part in this, while they were willing to go along with Gygax on this, nevertheless they only permitted Williams to buy 50 shares at $300, not even a third of the $50,000 initial investment that had been planned. And when asked to add her as the seventh member of the board, the matter was tabled. But she would get the VP role and be made Chief Operations Officer to handle those day-to-day matters so that Gygax needn't be bothered. This meeting is when a contentious event happened. Gygax had a private discussion with Kevin and Brian Bloom, far away from any witnesses or recordings of any kind, to discuss the problem with their buyout. According to the Blooms, Gygax had said that he would personally buy their shares. According to Gygax, he said no such thing. In either case, the Blooms accepted the severance package, smaller for Kevin because of his role in the scandal involving that stipend. The agreement was signed by Lorraine Williams, despite the fact that E. Gary Gygax was listed as the one whose signature was needed, one of many, many times that she was required to sign on behalf of the president. Gygax was more interested in writing his fiction, seeing as how Dragons of Autumn Twilight had helped pave the way for full-length novels through TSR. His first was going to be set in Greyhawk, published through TSR just like that and then distributed by Random House per their agreement. This was now his focus, not running day-to-day operations, not even the new D&D work that would have his name on it, Oriental Adventures, which was written by 2 members of the staff, though it should be noted that Gygax did ensure that his royalty would be split between them. Things started looking better and the salary reductions were reversed, but TSR had to deal with a number of problems related to its unsecured debt, the failure with the miniatures market, and $1 million in product that they had no hope of selling, either because it was overprinted or was obsolete. The result of an audit was horrifying, The bank had been right. Gygax had no idea how bad the problem was. TSR had a loss of $3.8 million that year. That figure was so horrifying, they had to suppress it. If it was known that they had had that kind of loss, regardless of what else might be going on, they would lose their 60-day line of credit with their vendors, and without that, they couldn't sell products. There'd be no saving the company then. The company newsletter told everyone that their efficiency and commitment at cutting costs had been what helped to turn things around. But scuttlebutt around the office was that Lorraine Williams had been a big part of why they were able to get paid back the difference in their salaries from that pay cut. In contrast, the bank had said not to renew the lease on the King Vidor Ranch. But Gygax did it anyway. The board was shocked at this, especially because they only found out because Huber contacted the rental agency. And it wasn't as if Gygax was paying for this out of his own pocket. He had to eventually be persuaded to sacrifice some of his royalties in order to pay it off. It was one of many signals to the board that he didn't take TSR's dire financial position seriously. In a situation harkening back to the ridiculous position of the leading company of the industry and the organization that represented that industry being enemies, the board found itself now at odds with the chief shareholder, president, and CEO of their own company. The Blooms as well were getting frustrated. They'd sent their intent to sell an offer to sell and gotten nothing, so they sent another. Then they hand-delivered another. In the tough financial situation, buying out the Blooms was not possible, so they got the runaround. And Williams finally was personally given a letter from them, copied to the board, stating that they had only accepted the severance with the promise by Gygax to buy their shares. But Gygax, who was in Milwaukee for that year's Gen Con, ignored the issue completely until the convention was finally over, and then he wrote back to say he'd made no such offer. He claimed he'd only agreed to try to arrange a consortium to buy them out, but he never promised to personally do so, and certainly not for the price of $500 per share that they wanted. Certain that the Blooms could do nothing but grind their teeth, Gygax went back to ignoring his company. He was supposed to attend a meeting with the bank because TSR exceeded their spending cap and they were at risk of losing their credit entirely. Gygax, Williams, and James Huber were to all meet with them to discuss what to do about this. But Gygax went to L.A. instead. Williams and Huber had to cover for him with people who were already concerned that TSR was unreliable. It was just one more sign for the leadership in the company and for the board that Gygax was either disconnected from the reality of the situation or simply didn't care. It was at that moment, when the company was on the edge of survival, that the latest and most devastating attack took place. Before I tell you what happened, though, I feel I have to share this part. The program 60 Minutes has long been lauded as a great example of television journalism. Yet in 1977, The New Yorker did an investigation into 60 Minutes itself by Michael J. Arlen. In an article called The Prosecutor, Arlen noted that the show's Dan Rather handled the subject of his story, corruption in Wyoming, as if he were a prosecutor trying to convince a jury, not a journalist trying to provide facts. When Arlen himself followed up, he discovered that Rather had a whole bunch of highly dubious conclusions that were on display here. This is important to note because while 60 Minutes had a great reputation, the fact of the matter is they were extremely one-sided when they came down on things. They were effectively putting something on trial, and in this case, that something was Dungeons and Dragons. Patricia Pulling was found and tapped for the special. Head of an organization and mother of a boy driven to suicide by the game, she was the perfect face for it. Gary Gygax came to defend the game, along with Dieter Sturm, formerly of the Playboy Resort and now head of TSR Public Relations. He pointed out to Ed Bradley that in an age of teen suicide epidemics, that they could have lots of things in common, like watching TV or playing sports. It was simply statistics that said a certain number of people who play Dungeons and Dragons would commit suicide because a certain number of teens would commit suicide. But Bradley disregards this and asks, if you found 12 kids in murder-suicide with one connecting factor, wouldn't you question it? Gygax says that he would question it only in a scientific manner. Thus, Dr. Thomas Radecki is brought in, a teacher at the University of Illinois Medical School. By which I mean a charlatan, a man who claimed those credentials despite the school having issued a statement making clear he never had any teaching position with them, only a brief unpaid role some years ago. But 60 Minutes had no concern for a little thing like a lack of credentials, only in his extremely scientific conclusion that D&D is directly responsible for child suicide.
You have careful notes. You have eyewitnesses. For instance, one case, the parents saw their child summon Dungeons and Dragons demons into his room before he killed himself.
Yes, you heard right. Science now means I completely believe that a child summoned demons. If you had any doubt that this was nothing but an absurdist hatchet job, just remember that the celebrated journalist is far more skeptical of statistics than he is of a publicly disavowed fraud who just claimed a child could summon demons. There's a question so old it dates back to the 3rd century, whose modern equivalent is, have you stopped beating your wife yet? A preposterously loaded question because baked into it is a presumption of guilt. If you've ever felt during this series that Gary Gygax should be punished for any of his petty behavior, having Ed Bradley give him such a question on national television is probably punishment enough.
Don't you really think that you have to rethink your position about the game and at least make known the potential for abuse of the game?
Perhaps every copy of D&D should have a sticker on it stating that, warning, according to a man with no credentials whatsoever, this product can summon demons. The only undeniable evidence that exists that people exposed to D&D can be cursed is the fact that Dr. Radecki was repeatedly stripped of his license to practice medicine until he was finally jailed because he was allegedly trading drugs for sex. The 60 Minutes piece gave mainstream legitimacy to one grieving mother's self-delusion, who was quickly latched on to by the private investigator William Deere, who used this as a great opportunity to hawk his new book. The PR blow was devastating, and with Gygax's seeming indifference to the company's financial problems on one hand, and Ed Bradley goading him into ranting that maybe chairs need warning labels because disturbed people can beat someone to death with one, TSR was on shaky ground with its creditors. They wanted additional collateral now, trademarks and service marks, to continue TSR's line of credit. Gygax wouldn't wear it, saying that things like Greyhawk and Gen Con's names were his personal property, that going forward anything he authored or co-authored would not credit TSR, or else he wouldn't publish the work here. He'd go somewhere else, which would deny them a cut of the funds that was providing TSR's most lucrative source. The comments on this video might very well be filled with how I'm glossing over the sins of Lorraine Williams. Look, we're going to get to Lorraine Williams' problems in the future, but right now we're addressing the problems that exist under Gary Gygax's watch. And the fact of the matter is, if he had remained in control, Dungeons and Dragons might not exist today. TSR certainly would have gone under. People who say that it wouldn't have, that he had some plan, are either ignorant of the depth of the financial situation or extremely confused as to what was taking place. The most plausible answer that I've heard from any of these conspiracy theory people was my uncle said that he worked at TSR and that Gygax had a plan involving foreign currency tricks that would solve this problem. To which I say, oh yeah, I actually do know about that, because TSR was already doing this financial trick, had been for a while. If it hasn't solved the problem yet, it wasn't about to. Normally I include all of my sources at the very end of a series, but in this particular case, up against the face of the accusations that have been thrown around, the claims that Lorraine Williams hated gamers and stabbed Gygax in the back to the detriment of TSR and Dungeons and Dragons, I have to tell you now, Two of them. One of them is called Slaying the Dragon by Ben Riggs. The other is called Game Wizards by John Peterson. Peterson took an approach of finding as many original documents as he possibly could. Letters, handwritten in some cases, internal company documents, records, wherever he could to try to piece together exactly what happened. Ben Riggs interviewed as many people as he could to get first-hand accounts of the events that took place. The conclusion between both of them is the same. The company would not have survived if Gary Gygax had stayed in control. If you don't like Lorraine Williams, that's fine. Many of the people who were interviewed said that she was not a pleasant person to be around, but that she knew what she was doing. And here are two undeniable truths. To secure TSR's future, Lorraine Williams, the supposed hater of gamers, put substantial amounts of money into the company. Gygax would not even allow TSR trademarks to be used as collateral to try to keep the lights on. If you're inclined to point to things that Gygax said to try to disprove that, please keep one unpleasant fact in mind, in spite of the fact that, yes, we all owe him a great debt for bringing RPGs to the mainstream. That unpleasant fact is, he was a liar. I'm sorry to have to say that, but when you claim that you quit your job to pursue a dream, when in reality you were fired for stealing office supplies, your comments are suspect after that. The ugly truth is that for the board, many of the executives, and Lorraine Williams, Gygax was not the answer to the problem. He was an obstacle to solving the problems. That TSR existed only to further his whims and ambitions. Or if not, that he clearly was not connected to reality anymore because he wasn't acting like someone who had the company's best interest at heart. Gygax was backing them all into a corner and making clear the only way out was going to be over his proverbial dead body. Lorraine Williams was just the one who was prepared to wield the knife. When Gygax went out of town to do an address for a group of psychiatrists, before spending several days speaking to New York publishers, Williams took the first step in her plans. She contacted Kevin Bloom and asked to meet, which they did later that day, joined by Brian. She brought along Martins to lay out her plan. The following day, she gave a check to Brian Bloom for $70,000 so that he could use that to purchase 700 shares at $100 each, just like Gygax had done. They then sent out a letter of intent to sell, this time at $350 per share, around what the original offer had been. Gygax had seen so many of these by now that he dismissed this one too, although he had noted that the price had gone down and considered maybe sometime down the line, if they lowered still further, I could scoop them up and then sell them for a profit. The initial 10-day window for TSR to buy the shares began, and Martins then informed everyone that Wisconsin law prohibited the company from making the purchase due to the lack of their funds. Gygax dismissed the letter like all the rest, having forgotten three things. First, math. By buying 700 shares, Brian Bloom increased the total number of shares which existed, which means that Gygax's percentage of control would then drop below 50%. He would no longer have a controlling interest. Second, while Williams hadn't purchased any TSR stock yet, her right to do so still extended for a few more days. And finally, thanks to that change to the shareholder agreement for the Foreman Group, all Williams had to do was just wait for that to expire, then she could purchase as much of the stock as she liked. On the last possible day, she bought her 50 shares. Then, once Brian received his additional 700, arrangements were made between Williams and Brian, Kevin, and Melvin Bloom to purchase all the remaining stocks of TSR, paid in installment payments over 4 years. Lorraine Williams was now the majority shareholder of the company. If you're inclined to still think that some heiress slipped in behind Gygax's back and stole the way the company built like some kind of cartoon villain, Gygax's next course of action should remind you that he did not have the company's best interests at heart. And like it or not, today, Lorraine Williams was the hero. Still refusing to budge at all on any front to try to get support back from the banks, Gygax sent out a memo stating he was going to reduce the size of the board to only 3 members going forward, and that those remaining 3 would no longer receive compensation, $12,000 annually, plus $500 per meeting attended. No, the money saved would not solve their financial problem, not to mention it was the only incentive being provided to the non-shareholders. By definition, as a non-shareholder, you have no financial stake in the company. They were being compensated for the time and wisdom that they were providing. They brought in experience, and what's more, they brought in legitimacy. Keep that in mind. The most generous interpretation of this move by Gygax was that he was a bully willing to perform an elaborate bluff to try to bludgeon people into getting what he wanted. If he actually planned to go forward with this, then he was either, I'm sorry to say this, but I am being serious, too crazy or too stupid to remain in control. The bank has serious concerns about TSR already. Do you think their minds would be put at ease if Gygax were to start removing sound financial minds, giving him practical business solutions, simply because they would not bend to his every whim? Gygax had controlling interest in the company. He did not have the reality infinity stone. He could not make things not be the way they were simply because he didn't like them. If he tried, all he would do is cause the banks to cut off their lines of credit, call in the loans, probably sue TSR, and definitely drive the company into bankruptcy. The board called an emergency meeting the next day, which Gygax accepted, likely thinking they were going to in some way acquiesce to his demands. Instead, the master wargamer walked straight into an ambush. He finally realized the math was no longer working out in his favor, even though he'd been informed of what was going on. In fact, it was his job to sign those shares. But as was usually the case, the day-to-day stuff was left to Lorraine Williams, who thus, perfectly legally, was signing control of his company over to herself. He would have known what she was up to if he would have been doing that part of his job. Keep in mind, if you think that Lorraine Williams stabbed him in the back, that it's very easy to stab someone in the back if they're sleeping hunched over their desk. Gygax didn't even know who the majority shareholder was now, but his power to push the board around had been broken. That was all that mattered. Upon Martin's announcement regarding the shares, Summer requested that Gygax resign as president, CEO, and chairman, but to remain on his creative capacity, where his interests obviously lay. He refused. A motion was immediately made to terminate him in those roles, and to no one's surprise, Gygax alone cast a vote against the motion. With that business dealt with, the board turned to the next item, replacing him, and the Blooms suggested that Summer replace him on the board, who agreed to the role, but who also made a motion that Williams, who was effectively doing the job anyway, be made president and CEO of TSR, over Gygax's objections. They then moved to give Gygax the same severance the Blooms had, a move that Kevin Bloom himself seconded. TSR Gary's reign of terror was at an end. Williams had pulled such an effective coup that everyone thought the Blooms were behind it, including Gygax. His first act was to send a cashier's check to Brian Bloom to purchase 650 shares of newly created stock at the price of $350 each. It was the first of 2 such payments that he would make, he said. As the 10-day limitation that had been stated in the letter was a purely arbitrary figure by the Blooms, Gygax technically had 90 days after TSR refused to buy them. But it hadn't occurred to him that Brian couldn't sell the shares because they'd already been sold. But then he couldn't find that out because he was no longer in a position to make demands to see all the shareholders in the company. He called in Don Lowry, former friend from Guidon Games, and his son to try to force the issue. But that move failed, and the pieces started to come together. He tried a restraining order to block the transfer, and his lawyer made the case that Gygax was denied the chance to make the purchase, which was his right. He tied things up for months, but those were months that Lorraine Williams continued to run TSR with the board's approval, working to get it through the financial crisis and out the other side solvent. By the end of August the following year, Gygax lost his case. He could not reasonably claim to have been denied the opportunity to buy the shares when the Blooms were bombarding him with letters to try to get him to buy them. Before we close out the Age of Dragons, I want to repeat something that I said earlier. Life is rarely as simple as a work of fiction with good guys and bad guys. Gygax made a lot of bad decisions as the head of TSR. But he was a great creator who was responsible for RPGs going from homebrew games to markets. Arneson was frequently mistreated, but he made his share of bad choices and mistakes too. And Lorraine Williams, as I said, who took over because somebody had to be the adult in the room at this critical moment, was not a saint either. Life's just not that simple, especially since she was going to be the one that would lead TSR in battle against the upstarts from the West Coast, those who would enter her Gen Con and walk away with treasure. The dragon is dead. Long live the dragon. And despair if you are a wizard seeking to vanquish it.